Deborah was an extremely important person for me in my intellectual and academic life. She was one of the readers for my book that you mentioned, the novel In the Age of Disintegration, and was, as everyone else says, she was an extremely close reader of books in review, and a wonderful reviewer to have, and very supportive of that, and also other articles of mine that she was also reviewer for. And also I met her for the first time when I was in graduate school, and throughout she was extremely generous and a wonderful colleague and thinker. And I still have students who are inspired by reading her Surprised by Shame and other books of hers. And then the other thing that I wanted to say is that although almost all of our bicentennial events are now over, there is still an undergraduate essay competition, an undergraduate research forum, which will take place in January. The deadline for that is actually next week on the 15th of December. So there is still an opportunity for undergraduates to submit entries to that forum. So thanks for posting that. So now I'm going to share my slides and we'll begin. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a great joy to be able to share this with you all. Okay, so start this and remove this. Okay, so towards the end of the epilogue of Crime and Punishment, actually, let me just show you, this is the kind of plan for the talk, just so you're able to follow along. So I'll be introducing the topic, and then there's several sections. And here is a picture of some nomads in Siberia, which is where we're going to start. Towards the end of the epilogue of Crime and Punishment, shortly before his epiphanic moment, Raskolnikov, about to start work for the day, hears the sound of singing coming from the other side of the river Irtysh and looks across at the nomads on the other side. Там, в облитой солнцем необозримой степи, чуть приметными точками чернились кочевые юрты. Там была свобода, и жили другие люди, совсем не похожие на здешних. Там как бы самое время остановилось. Точно не прошли еще века Авраама и стад его. Here the narrator takes on the godlike, prophetic tone that he voiced only a few times during the novel, most notably in the scene where Sonia reads the biblical passage of the raising of Lazarus to Raskolnikov. He invokes what would later become one of Dostoevsky's most beloved fantasies, the prelapsarian dream of a world before history, outside of time, before differentiation and individuation, that's also evoked in Stavrogin's dream in his Confession chapter, Versilov's dream in The Adolescent, and the planet paradise of Dream of a Ridiculous Man. The nomads offer a glimpse into a kind of synchronized time, which Dostoevsky's novels rarely offer. And indeed, here that world offers an escape from Raskolnikov's historicity, the state that shaped his Napoleonic idea and its assumptions. Unusually here, the source of the prelapsarian fantasy is Eastern in origin. The nomads, the indigenous people of Central Asia, rather than Western, the Greek landscape of the cradle of Western civilization in the golden age of Stavrogin and Versilov's dreams. The vision of the nomads helps to open up the transformation that takes place in Raskolnikov, his spiritual and ethical regeneration. Given Dostoevsky's lifelong post-exilic belief in Russian social and spiritual reconciliation and the politics of the Russian soil, it's odd that the promise of liberation from history comes not from Raskolnikov's fellow peasant convicts, from whom he feels particularly estranged and who respond coldly to him, but rather from the nomads. This source of the fantasy of atemporality is particularly interesting, given that only a couple of pages previously, the pestilence of Raskolnikov's dream of atomization is said to have spread from Asia to Europe. Asia is therefore presented as the source of an epidemic whose symptoms seem to represent modernity itself. So why then here do the nomads in their primitive liberation from temporality stand in for the Russian peasantry? In this paper, I examine possible reasons for this slippage by analyzing how models of temporality in Dostoevsky's works express his tangled imperialist imagination and how those tangles are shaped by his understanding of Russia's historical situation. I trace how he associates particular nations and ethnicities with particular temporalities. And this vision of uneven development, which sees Western European nations as riven by the temporal crisis of modernity and Asian ones as existing within a prelapsarian, prehistoric temporal space, while typical of the imperial mindset, intersect provocatively and problematically with Dostoevsky's understanding of Russia's own historical dilemma, in which he reaches back to a vision of pre-Petrine unity while recognizing and representing the impossibility of escaping historicity. So now I'm going to move into the first section of the talk, which is 1861 and the dream of social and historical reconciliation. Oh, sorry, let me go back. That's the wrong slide. Here we go. In order to see how Dostoevsky's views on Russian history and society are formed and develop over time, we need to go back to the heady days of the emancipation of the serfs, when, on his return from Siberia, he joined together with his brother Mikhail, the literary critic Apollon Grigoriev, and the philosopher Nikolai Strakhov, to found the journal Vremya, or Time, the mouthpiece of the Podchvenichestvo, or politics of the soil movement. The announcement for the publication of Time, which you have on the slide here, or an extract from it, refers to a prodigious change which is about to take place peacefully and with the consent of our entire nation, a change, quote, equivalent to the most outstanding events in our history and even to the great reforms of Peter the Great, unquote. The journal envisaged this change as the reintegration of a nation whose educated classes and narod had split apart 170 years before, following the Petrine reforms. While the nobility and the educated classes had got along with Peter's efforts to impose Western European cultural and political models onto Russian life, embracing modernization, and in the process becoming estranged from Russian national life or soil, the Narod had recoiled from the effects of modernization and maintained their old beliefs and traditions, their connectedness to the Russian soil. Ever since, in this narrative, the two groups had lived separate and independent lives. Now at last they would come together again as a result of the coming emancipation, which would at last allow the Narod to fully enter Russian life and contribute to Russian society, bringing new ideas and values to an intellectual discourse that had been too dependent on Western European models and structures for too long. The process of reconciliation would give rise to a new Russian consciousness as the two groups shared the ideas and beliefs they had developed during the years of their separate evolution and growth. The ensuing knowledge and insight would allow Russia to rediscover her inner national strength and creativity, to create new indigenous forms and ideas, and ultimately to offer Europe a great new Russian idea, an idea that would reconcile the disparate European nations, just as it would reconcile Russia's own divided society. This announcement introduces social and historical reconciliation as a key principle for Vremya, as well as suggesting a nuanced interpretation of the significance and legacy of the Petrine reforms as bringing about modernization and intellectual advancement, while also leaving a significant portion of the population behind. It's rooted in a liberal vision of historical progress while being candid about the mistakes of the past and their legacy in the present, and including a heavy dose of political optimism. For Vremya, the Emancipation Act marked the final collapse of the phase of Russian history that had begun with the reforms of Peter the Great, a phase marked by the estrangement of the increasingly westernizing nobility and later the Europeanized intelligentsia from the vast body of the Russian people, the Narod. The journal's founders believed that the emancipation would at last provide the possibility for the social, political, and cultural reconciliation of the estranged groups. The Narod would benefit from the cultural leadership of the nobility and intelligentsia, while the latter would be redeemed by the spiritual and religious faith and beliefs of the people. As the Narod came to play a more full and active role in the nation's social life, Russian culture would be renewed by its faith, belief, and ideas. They referred to this set of essential beliefs and ideas as the pochva, or the soil from which they took the name of their movement. Почвенничество. Strachov wrote, under the term soil are meant those basic and distinctive powers of a people which are the seeds of all of its organic manifestations. So this could include songs and stories or customs and traditions. And time, or vremya, saw the supposed spirit of reconciliation, the defining spirit of the emancipation period, as providing a way out of the bitter Slavophile westernizer conflicts that had further divided Russian society for the previous 3 decades. Now, of course, the spirit of optimism did not last too long, and this dream of reconciliation of the reform era, as well as the nuanced view of the Petrine reforms articulated in the announcement to Vremya, is gradually abandoned as a political reality by Dostoevsky through the course of the 1860s, and instead it's transformed into a dual interpretation of modernity as, on the one hand, characterized by collapse and disintegration, and on the other, as offering up the opportunity of reintegration, regeneration, and a return to pre-Petrine unity through a utopian messianic belief in the unifying power of the Russian idea, which becomes more and more tied into an imperialist outlook in a writer's diary. I've, of course, written about this process and its formal and aesthetic reverberations in my book, The Novel in the Age of Disintegration. But today, what I'm going to do is focus on how Dostoevsky's evolving ideas find their expression in different models of temporality, and how his dreams of social and cultural reconciliation find other avenues, and especially utopian political ones, which are manifested in a more explicitly imperialist mindset. So after discussing this dream of reconciliation, we now move to the second part of the talk, which is about what happens to that vision in the great novels, temporality and rupture in the great novels. So the collapse of the dream of reconciliation is chronicled in Dostoevsky's extensive meditations in his journalism of the 1860s, and then in the notebooks on the problem of history, and is then staged in his great novels through the medium of temporality. The legacy of Westernism, often referred to in shorthand as the Petrine period of Russian history, which Dostoevsky in notes associates with figures like Herzen, Turgenev, and so on. This turns out in his account to be more difficult to cast off than he and his fellow Porchveniki had hoped in the early 1860s. And in the great works, both Resnechiniets and aristocratic heroes find themselves reckoning with that history. In the mature works, the anticipated telos is always the individual's conversion, their redemption, which is coupled with the promise of the healing of the rupture between the gentry and the narod, the social and spiritual reconciliation of the Russian nation. But that goal is always threatened by the individual's status as nobleman and the socio-historical legacy of the westernized aristocracy. Of course, Resnechiniets in the case of Raskolnikov. Dostoevsky frequently represents the threat to reconciliation in temporal terms. So models of temporality associated with Europe and the West in general are shown to be regressive, teleological, whether bourgeois, Catholic, or revolutionary, while alternative temporalities remain the holy grail, desired and yet out of reach. Crime and Punishment represents a let's see, we need to go back to Crime and Punishment here. Crime and Punishment represents a hero temporally out of step with the world around him, with a name suggesting the rupture that's birthed him. Raskolnikov is, as Ilya Kliger has suggested, continually seeking to step over the stages of urban social development that we might find in an ordinary Bildungsroman. The suddenlies or vdrugs that Toporov has shown pepper the text reveal both an urban temporality of rapid, even overnight transformation, a sprint into modernity, the social costs of which are clear in Marmeladov's alcoholism, and the broken peasant migrants of the Haymarket, the prostitutes and the suicides. We might call it a Napoleonic or a Petrine temporality, the impulse to speed ahead while leaving the ordinary behind. Crime and Punishment depicts a world characterized by what Ernst Bloch has called der Gleichzeitigkeit des Ungleichzeitigen, the simultaneity of the non-simultaneous, or the synchronicity of the non-synchronous, or perhaps even the hazy outline of what would later be defined in Marxist thought as uneven and combined development. The novel shows Raskolnikov as inhabiting a temporality that's not synchronized with the world around him. He's out of step with his society. As I've discussed elsewhere in an article on the epilogue, the novel is structured around the twin impulses of deferral and anticipation, and these can be also seen in historical terms. Raskolnikov, trapped between the desire to prolong the possibility of being an extraordinary man and the longing to be found out and finalized, stages Russia's clash of modernity marked by the gap between the ambitions of the avant-gardist intelligentsia and the reality of its post-reform social ruptures. While the novel's epilogue ends with personal conversion, the promise of historical reconciliation is still far off, as Raskolnikov's conversion is preceded by a failure to understand the peasant convicts. The sight of the Central Asian nomads across the river, with their temporality free from historical rupture, offers a bewitching vision of synchronicity, which nonetheless never permeates the novel itself. It's as though he's synchronized with the Narod, but that idea is never fully developed because, of course, the novel ends. Okay, so let's move on to The Idiot. So The Idiot offers the promise of historical reconciliation through a hero who enters into Russian reality from the timeless idyll of Switzerland, promising in his first meeting with the Yapanchins to heal the broken social world of the novel. Yet that promise is soon betrayed as Myshkin turns out to embody the double bind of epileptic temporality, a model in which a vision of universal togetherness is followed by the sense of imminent mortality. This seems oddly to correspond with the novel's model of apocalyptic modernity evoked by Lebedev's series of anecdotes about the French Revolution. And of course, David Bethaya's wonderful reading of the novel emphasizes those connections. His temporality clashes with the Christian Lapsarian one of Nastasya Filipovna, who sees herself as defined by her fall, by the rape, of course, of Trotsky, who's trapped both by the impossibility of ever erasing that fall and by the vortical, inescapable endpoint of Rogojin's knife, which the narrator foreshadows from the novel's opening pages. The dream of social spiritual reconciliation is present here only in Myshkin's last act, as he gives an unseemly and clumsy speech about the imminent future renewal of all mankind through the Russian God, and of course has a go at Catholicism at the same time, in the moments before he smashes a priceless vase and falls into an insensibility that he never escapes from. And of course, then we get to the novels of the greatest collapse of structure and the peak of the crisis of temporality. That's Demons and the Adolescent, Biesi and Padrostok. Demons represents this crisis on all levels of its structure. While the novel is at first sight set within a very specific historical moment, and there's even a prehistory of the main plot, which references the Emancipation Manifesto and its aftermath. And the narrator at first seems apparently obsessed by time and uses temporal expressions at all times. In fact, the narrator turns out to be as confused about chronology to the extent that a reliable temporal scheme for the plot can never really be established. And the past history to which the novel seems irrevocably cut off while the glorious future to which so many of the characters are oriented turns out also to be out of reach. And instead, the novel is marooned in an overwhelming sense of presentness, cut off from past and future, as though its temporality has somehow congealed. Its apparent main hero, Nikolai Stavrogin, the westernized Russian aristocrat par excellence, has gone through all of his previous developments prior to the novel's main plot, and his previous stages of development remain only in the warped ideas of his deluded acolytes, Petrusha Verkhovensky, Shatov, and Kirillov. And the novel takes on the appearance of a misshapen, contorted Bildungsroman in which normal narrative development becomes impossible. The notebooks to the novel reveal the historical events and developments which broke in upon the work's development. As Dostoevsky was getting to the end after the first part of the novel had already been published, which events that include the outbreak of the Franco-Prussian War, the Paris Commune with its burning of the Tuileries Palace, all of which Dostoevsky saw as the ultimate sign of the decline of the West and a powerful argument against Russian Westernism. The Commune is invoked in the plans for the speech that Stepan Verkhovensky makes at Yulia von Lemke's ball, attacking the corruption of Russian modernity, that includes a reference to the burning of the Tuileries as marking the abolition of history. The burning here symbolizes the end of history as conceptualized by Stepan Verkhovensky, that is, the end of Russian Westernism's historical narrative. And the Biesi, other than providing the Stepan's conversion on his deathbed that suggests some other kind of way out of this destruction, other than that, really ends with Stavrogin's suicide and with no real alternative model at the end of the work. And then we move on to the Adolescent, Podrostok, which perhaps more than any of Dostoevsky's other novels stages the collapse of the Russian gentry Westernism through the figure of Versilov, the titular adolescent's aristocratic father. Towards the end of the novel, Versilov narrates to his son Arkady both his prelapsarian dream of a golden age before history and his vision of the post-Petrine Russian European gentry mission, a mission which he bemoans has now collapsed as a result of European decline, that very Franco-Prussian War, Paris Commune, and burning of the Tuileries Palace, which dominate the notebooks to the novel. Versilov's dramatic collapse at the end of the work plays out the collapse of his social estate and its corrupted history. The novel stages these national, historical, and social tensions on formal and allegorical levels in the relations between the illegitimate son and accidental hero Arkady, who embodies the shapelessness of the novel itself, and the two fathers whose legacy he bears, the Russian European aristocrat Versilov and the peasant pilgrim Makar, a figure of intrigue and potentiality whose death ultimately closes off to Arkady the possibility of engaging with his peasant heritage. You'll notice that I don't talk about the brothers Karamazov here. I'm not going to be talking about that in this talk, but if you have questions about how this argument might fit with a novel that seems in fact to resolve some of these difficulties, I'll be happy to talk about that in the question period. While representing their aristocratic and Resnichinets heroes in the throes of temporal crisis and presenting an ever more sustained attack on the historicity of Russian gentry and intelligent identity, the mature novels never really provide an alternative, any kind of model of narod temporality or resynchronized history. There is no equivalent here to the mowing scene of Anna Karenina, where an aristocratic hero learns to synchronize himself to the agricultural time of the Russian peasantry, as Vadim Schneider has analyzed so brilliantly in his book, Russia's Capitalist Realisms. Instead, the majority of the peasant characters, such as the escaped convict Fyedka in Biesi, bear the marks of their historical relationship to the aristocracy, the social and psychological fallout of the original sin of serfdom. Only in The Adolescent does the illegitimate Arkady, who inherits the westernizer gentry legacy of his aristocratic father and the spirituality of the soil from his peasant mother and pilgrim stepfather, seem to represent the possibility of finding some kind of a new way of negotiating Russia's complex history of uneven development, of bridging the gap between the gentry intelligentsia and the narod. In a writer's diary, Dostoevsky's monojournal, written in 1876 and 1877, and then taken up again in 1880 and 1881 before his death, the writer finds another escape from the historical sins of Russian Westernism and their legacy, expansionist imperial fantasies. And so now we're going to move on to the next section of the talk, which is our imperial temporality as displacement. So how this vision that in many ways fails or is kind of collapsed in the great novels becomes regenerated in a certain way, or how it sort of becomes displaced by a sense of the colonial other. So, having examined the source of Dostoevsky's desires for social and historical reconciliation, the collapse of that reconciliation staged in the great novels, and the ideological context for the longing for the escape from historicity represented by the nomads in Crime and Punishment, it's now time to look more deeply into the dynamics of Dostoevsky's imperial temporality. And to do that, I want to move back to Raskolnikov's sighting of the nomads on the banks of the Irtysh and look at a very similar scene, which it echoes from notes from the House of the Dead, which you have here on the slide. So Goryanchikov explains in this section that he liked hauling bricks by the Irtysh because of the sense of freedom that the riverbank provided. На берегу же можно было забыться. Смотришь, бывало, в этот необъятый пустынный простор, точно заключенный из окна своей тюрьмы на свободу. Here too, the presence of a non-Russian person and non-Russian space is associated with timelessness and with freedom. Все для меня было тут дорого и мило, и яркое горячее солнце на бездонном синем небе, и далекая песня киргиза, приносившаяся с киргизского берега. Всматриваешься долго и разглядишь, наконец, какую-нибудь бедную, обкуренную юртку, какого-нибудь байгуша, разглядишь дымок и юрты, киргизку, которая о чем-то там хлопочет своими двумя баранами. Все это бедно и дико, но свободно. This whole scene is one of deceleration, of a slow absorption of the river, its inhabitants, the animals, birds, and flowers of the riverbank, and of the flow of the river itself, which represents a freedom from the fortress and from the sentence being served. The scene takes place towards the end of Notes from the House of the Dead, in a summer interlude following the narration of one of the most horrifying stories of the whole work, Akulka's husband. The story of the beautiful Akulka, who's slandered and then married to a man who believes her to be a fallen woman, but then discovers her innocence. And when her slanderer is later forced to join the army, he asks for her forgiveness. And she then tells her husband that she's in love with the slanderer, and the husband slits her throat in a lot of gory detail. The story marks the trough of the meaningless cruelty of the criminality depicted in Notes from the House of the Dead, providing a vision of unredeemed and unredeemable Russian peasant cruelty and suffering, a cycle within which Goryanchikov, as a Russian nobleman, is implicated. The work on the riverbank in the summer marks an escape from the darkness of this vision, while the Kyrgyz peasant and the nomad's yurt serve as reference points that shake Gorianchikov out of his own historicity, his individuation, allowing him to forget his situation and become suffused into the landscape. As we shall see, colonial otherness also provides an escape from the socio-historical connectedness of Russian peasant and nobleman. Harriet Murav argues that Russian writers inscribe Siberia into a sacred topography, representing it alternately as heaven and hell. The well-known bath scene in Notes from the House of the Dead encapsulates the idea of the Siberian stockade as hell, the riverbank scene, as is, of course, its heavenly analog. Siberia becomes the key location of salvation in Dostoevsky's autobiographical narrative, first in the supposed resurrection of his fictional alter ego, Gorianchikov, in Notes from the House of the Dead, and later, more directly, in Peasant Marie, in a writer's diary, as the place where he first comes into contact with the Narod, experiences the differences between the Polish aristocrats, who, of course, whose contempt for the Narod he describes at length, and himself and his own social symbiotic relationship with the Russian peasants at the camp. Murav writes, for Dostoevsky, Siberia is not part of a forward movement towards a new political ordering, but part of a renunciation of revolutionary thought and the embrace of an idealized primitive state, the primitive state of the Narod and of the author's own childhood. I contend that the primitive nomads and the temporality they represent in Dostoevsky's thinking, prelapsarian, ahistoric timelessness, offer the opportunity of escaping from the historicity of Russian modernity and of the continuing existence of the Petrine social rupture, the gap between the Europeanized gentry and the Narod. The source of the double repression and displacement in Siberia, the origin both of Dostoevsky's fictionalization of his conversion experience and belief in national, social, and spiritual reconciliation in Notes from the House of the Dead, and of his self-mythologization of those same narratives in a writer's diary and elsewhere. In her powerful revisionist account of Dostoevsky's discovery of what she calls his democracy, Nancy Rutenberg, his encounter with the spiritual potentiality of the Narod and its role in Russia's redemptive mission, Nancy Rutenberg analyzes the importance of Gorianchikov's psychosocial disarticulation of self and estrangement in Notes from the House of the Dead as a necessary part of the conversion experienced. Deprived of the privileges of his gentry identity within the space of Katorga, Gorianchikov, she argues, first struggles to preserve the components of that identity. He tries to kind of hold together his psychosocial identity. But later he learns that this isolation brings the possibility of reconceiving his identity completely and disavowing the gentry identity that serves as a barrier to his communication with the peasant convicts who represent the Narod. And disavowing that gentry identity, he can theoretically surrender his selfhood and stand as proof of the possibility of social and spiritual reconciliation with the Narod. And yet, as Rutenberg argues, that disavowal is never complete, and Gorianchikov's conversion remains ultimately unconsummated. There is a slippage, she shows, between Dostoevsky's authorial consciousness and Gorianchikov's narrative. Dostoevsky demonstrates that Gorianchikov's efforts are ultimately unsuccessful. The bizna that he refers to time and time again in the text, the abyss of the horror of the camp experience, and the gap that separates him from the other prisoners, which dominates his narrative, can never be bridged. Gorianchikov prefigures, in many ways, the Shatov of demons in his status as a nobleman who does believe, right? Who will believe, who will supposedly be reconciled with the Narod at some point in the future, but who dies or whose narrative is prematurely closed before that reconciliation is ever articulated. In disavowing his gentry identity, Gorianchikov, and through him Dostoevsky, seeks to renounce the historical narrative within which the Russian gentry are embedded, the story of the split of the gentry and the narod as a result of the Europeanizing Petrine reforms, the narrative that, as we've seen, would go on so significantly to shape the great novels. The disavowal of gentry identity and gentry history, an embrace of the spiritual mission of the Narod, has profoundly spatio-temporal implications within Notes from the House of the Dead and beyond. First of all, we might think about the supposed conversion taking place in Siberia, a place with a very different history from that of Moscow, St. Petersburg, and the spaces of European Russia within which Gorianchikov's and Dostoevsky's own historical identities were formed. Though the Omsk stockade may, as Rutenberg claims, be a permanent space of exception which gathered and formally neutralized the differences between members of the various classes, ethnicities, and religions within Russia proper, as well as the peoples of the empire. Oops, sorry, just a second. Here we go. Back to here. Within the peoples of the empire. In fact, the empire's presence does make itself felt, and differentiation is one of Gorianchikov's survival strategies. The location of the prison camp on the banks of the river Irtysh, on the border of what is now Kazakhstan, and of Dostoevsky's subsequent place of exile, Semipalatinsk, which he wrote to his brother Mikhail, was, quote, almost on the Kyrgyz steppe, unquote. Makes it a place of Russian colonization. And as Anne Dwyer has observed, Notes from the House of the Dead depicts a microcosm of the Russian Empire that includes Poles, indigenous people from the Caucasus, Ukrainians, Tatars, Gypsies, steppe nomads, and Jew. Gorianchikov writes, «И какого народу тут не было. Я думаю, каждая губерния, каждая полоса России имела тут своих представителей. Были и инородцы, было несколько сильных, даже из кавказских горцев. Со всей Руси прислали сюда преступники». So Gorianchikov's narration, of course, focuses more on the non-ethnically Russian prisoners than it does on either the Russian ones of his own class or the Russian peasants. As Rutenberg points out, the ethnographic mode is one of Gorianchikov's main strategies of attempting to overcome the bizna, especially in the early days at the camp. Dwyer has shown how Gorianchikov's focus on three non-Russian prisoners in particular, the Dagestani Tatar Aliyeh, the Pole M. Mtsitsky, and the Jew Bumstein, engage with Russian romantic models and find them inadequate. The focus on non-Russian prisoners also serves as a kind of displacement of Gorianchikov's and Dostoevsky's problem of the Russian gentry-peasant divide. M's declaration of hatred for the peasant prisoners serves as a substitution both for the Russian gentry's estate culpability towards the peasants and for the Russian Empire's culpability against Polish national determination. And it's worth noting here, by the way, that in the memoirs of Polish political prisoners, they assert, in fact, that it was Dostoevsky who was so keen to preserve social hierarchy between himself and the peasant prisoners, and that the Poles viewed all the convicts in the camp rather as their equals. So what he writes about the Poles has very much to do, I think, with self-mythologization. In later texts, such as Peasant Marie, the scapegoating of the Polish aristocrats for the sins of the Russian gentry runs its full course. And in the same way, the Kyrgyz peasant and the Central Asian nomads' huts offer a possibility of escape from national historical tragedy that's precluded by the debased, criminalized Russian peasant convicts who continue to remind Gorianchikov and who perhaps continued to remind Dostoevsky himself of the biznā of the camp and of his own social isolation. And now we're going to move to the final section of the talk, which is entitled Between Europe and Asia, a Geographical Solution to a Historical Dilemma. If Dostoevsky's mature novels wrestle with and ultimately fail to resolve the problem of Russia's historical legacy and entwine social, historical, and cultural relations with the Europe that Dostoevsky so often wants to leave behind, A Writer's Diary begins to explore new paths escaping the social costs of modernization. The diary makes the sacral nature of Dostoevsky's historiography more explicit even than it had been in the novels. The even-handed idea of social reconciliation that was present in the 1860s journalism is gone. Here, Europe has nothing to offer the world, nor does the tarnished Russian gentry, and instead it's the Russian peasantry alone that offer the possibility of salvation for the world and the only escape from apocalyptic modernity. Already in the 1873 version of A Writer's Diary, the column that appeared in the pages of the journal The Citizen or Grajdanin in works like Vlas, Dostoevsky begins to speak of the Russian people's mission of sharing their own particular vision of Christ with a fallen Europe. And in 1876, in articles like Musing About Europe, he expounded on the topic of Europe's disintegration, got engaged in diatribes against conservative critics who disparaged the people, and while at the same time bolstering the narrative of his Siberian conversion in works like Peasant Marie. With the advance of tensions in the Balkans and the beginning of the Russo-Turkish War, the stakes are raised dramatically, and Dostoevsky begins to advocate for particular policies as well as defending the Russian mercenaries gone to defend their Slavic brothers. But here a new note begins to sound, one of imperial expansionism. The turn of the 1880s saw Russia completing its conquest of Central Asia with General Skobelyev's 1881 defeat of the Teke Turkmens at the fortress Göktepe, the reversal of an ignominious defeat by the Turkmens at the same place in 1879. And in one of the very last entries of A Writer's Diary in January 1881, just the month before Dostoevsky's death, in this piece called Göktepe, What Does Asia Mean to Us? Dostoevsky celebrates Russia's imperial expansion into Central Asia and bemoans the lack of interest among the general public in this victory. Its significant lies, he suggests, in the fact that it will lead to a national self-examination that will force Russians to admit that they are not only European, but also Asian. Though Russian Asia still feels like an appendage, he argues, it's time to reconsider such a perspective. This will finally efface the shame that Russians feel at the idea that Europe will consider them Asians. Europe is associated with the past, not the future, he claims, and though it's hard to turn away from the window on Europe that's always defined Russian identity, the conquest of Asia represents a new principle according to which Russia can develop. Classic imperialist discourse melds here with historical national insecurity. In Europe, we were hangers-on and slaves, while in Asia we shall be the masters. In Europe, we were Tartars, while in Asia we are the Europeans. Our mission, our civilizing mission in Asia will encourage our spirit and draw us on. Just build 2 railways and begin with that. One railway to Siberia, another to Central Asia, and you shall see the results at once. It's, I think, astonishing that Dostoevsky, who fears and bemoans modernity in his novels, and most clearly perhaps in the apocalyptic image of the train and the idiot as the harbinger of collapse and disintegration, here cheerleads for the modernization of Central Asia and advocates the building of railways. This passage in this article can be understood only in the context of Dostoevsky's almost lifelong preoccupation with Russian history, an obsession with the social and spiritual reconciliation. His supposed conversion in Siberia was connected to a hope for the healing of the historical social rupture between the gentry, intelligentsia, and the people that gradually becomes disappointed through the 1860s and 70s and congeals into a utopian messianic belief in the Russian people's Christ-bearing potential. However, that belief is continually challenged by an awareness both of the social fragmentation of the peasantry itself and of his own social estate's culpability in this process of fragmentation. Though the idea of Central Asia as representing an escape from historicity that first appears in the works of the 1860s might seem to conflict in Dostoevsky's later journalistic writings with its potentiality of as a space of conquest, in fact, I think they complement each other. The nomads on the other side of the river represent a vision of social and spiritual purity that the Russian Narod cannot, marked as they are by the trauma imposed on them by the Petrine reforms that brought them into history, a sin which Dostoevsky places on Europe's conscience in his journalism, but which marks the gentry heroes of his novels. The nomads and the land from which they come represents a new historical possibility for the Russian nation in Dostoevsky's mind, another way of escaping Russia's complicated historical engagement with Europe and a clean slate for imperial self-definition. The quote-unquote primitive nomads and the conquest of Central Asia and the temporalities they represent in Dostoevsky's thinking, a prelapsarian ahistoric timelessness on the one hand, and a post-European, post-historical glorious futurity on the other, both offer the opportunity of escaping from the historicity of Russian modernity and of the continuing existence of the Petrine social rupture. Imperialist fantasies of Asian atemporality and non-historicity offer the opportunity of repressing anxieties about failed Russian social reconciliation. It is Central Asian nomads who can serve as tabula rasa for liberational peasant fantasies rather than the peasants of European Russia, who inconveniently offer examples of social collapse and moral and spiritual corruption that's a result of the exploitation meted out by a system enforced over a couple of centuries by Russia's own gentry class and imperfectly liberated from that system in 1861. And imperial temporalities also create the possibility of displacing anxieties about Russia's European legacy. The embrace of Asia as an empty space of possibility can offer an alternative to the historically entangled relations of Russia and Europe that can help disguise the impossibility of genuinely relinquishing the historical and cultural baggage of Russia's Europeanized history. And thank you very much. I will end there.